a trading port where no wind ever seemed to stop, ships from directions most maps refused to name, and somewhere in the middle of all that salt and timber and spice, a handshake that moved gold across half the world. Welcome to Echoes of Ancients. If you care about stories that were buried before they could be told, subscribe now. We find them anyway. There are two ways a civilization enters the historical record. The first way is loud: conquest, monuments, written treaties signed by kings with long names. Empires that built in stone tend to survive in memory. The second way is quieter and far more interesting. Some civilizations entered history through commerce, through the patient accumulation of trust, through networks so vast and so decentralized that no single ruler could claim them, and no single enemy could destroy them. The Ottoman Empire chose the first path. Well, the ancient merchants of the Philippine Archipelago chose the second. One left palaces. The other left patterns, in trade routes, in textile dyes, in the gold weight standards that traveled quietly from one port to the next. To understand what actually happened between these two worlds, you need to step back from the word Philippines entirely. Forget the colonial map. Before Spanish galleons appeared on the horizon, the archipelago was a constellation of maritime polities: Tondo, Butuan, Sulu, Maguindanao, and others. Each one a sovereign trading hub with its own diplomats, its own currency logic, and its own relationships extending thousands of kilometers outward. Butuan alone sent formal tributary missions to Song Dynasty China in 1001 CE. That is not a small fact. That is a civilization announcing itself to the most sophisticated bureaucratic empire on Earth in its own language of protocol and gift-giving. These were not isolated fishing communities stumbling onto foreign shores. These were professionals. The gold from Butuan, hammered into thin sheets and woven into burial suits for elite dead, was already legendary before most of Europe had a coherent economy. Archaeologists have recovered gold artifacts from the Philippines dating to the 9th and 10th centuries with a purity that matched nothing else in Southeast Asia. The goldsmiths knew what they were doing. So did the merchants who sold it. Now place that image next to the Ottoman reality of the 15th and 16th centuries. Think about it. The Ottoman Empire at its height was the most powerful transit economy in the known world. It controlled the choke points, the Bosphorus, the Red Sea approaches, the overland Silk Road corridors through Anatolia and the Levant. If you wanted to move goods between Asia and Europe, you paid the Ottomans, in tariffs, in permissions, in political deference. But there was a flaw in that control, a structural one. Moving on. The Ottomans were extraordinary administrators of existing routes. They were less agile when the routes shifted. And in the 15th century, routes shifted constantly, not because of war alone, but because of the spice trade's relentless pressure to find cheaper paths, faster ships, and more reliable partners. Spices were not luxury accessories in medieval trade. They were preservation chemistry. They were medicine. They were the difference between a profitable cargo and a rotting one. Whoever controlled the spice supply controlled something closer to infrastructure than to commerce. All right. The archipelago, particularly the Sulu Sultanate and the ports of Mindanao, sat directly on the maritime spice corridor that ran from the Maluku Islands westward, through Borneo, through the Java Sea, and eventually into the Indian Ocean network. Every clove, every nutmeg, every bundle of cinnamon moving toward the Middle East passed through or near these waters. And the merchants who operated those waters were not passive conduits. They negotiated, they set prices. Let's say they formed alliances with Malay sultanates, with Javanese traders, with the port lords of Brunei. By the time any cargo reached the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, the Ottoman sphere, it had already passed through a system of agreements that the Ottomans did not design and could not fully override. Stop for a moment and sit with that image. A merchant from Sulu calculating the value of his nutmeg shipment is indirectly dictating terms to a sultan in Istanbul, not through armies, through scarcity and distance. That is a kind of power that doesn't appear in battle histories. The gold payment dynamic came from a specific structural reality. The Islamic commercial networks that connected the Sulu Sultanate to the wider Muslim world, through Malacca, through Aceh, through the Indian Malabar coast, operated on trust systems and on hard currency, truly currency, gold. Not promises, not letters of credit backed by a distant throne. Gold, weighed and verified, changing hands between men who had usually never met face to face, but who trusted the network they both belonged to. When Ottoman merchants, or merchants operating under Ottoman commercial jurisdiction, wanted access to the deep spice supply, they entered this system. And the system had its own rules. Rules that were older than the Ottoman state itself. There's a catch. The gold flowed inward toward the archipelago, partly because that's where the supply originated, and partly because the Filipino merchant networks had already established something the Ottomans respected enormously: reputation. A track record measured not in decades, but in centuries. Tondo had been trading with China since at least the 10th century. The Sulu Sultanate had formalized Islamic commercial relationships across the Indian Ocean network by the 14th century. These were not newcomers asking for a place at the table. They were the table. And here is where the two civilizations diverge most sharply and most instructively. You know, now pay attention. The Ottoman model relied on geographic control. Hold the passage and you hold the trade. This worked brilliantly for land routes and narrow maritime choke points. But it became a liability when the trade moved to open ocean. You cannot build a fortress in the middle of the Banda Sea. All right. The Philippine maritime model relied on relational control. Know the captain, know his family, know which port he trusts and which one he avoids. Build enough of those relationships and you don't need a fortress. You are the network. When Portuguese expansion disrupted the Malaccan route in the early 16th century, seizing Malacca itself in 1511, the Ottoman adjacent trade system suffered a serious structural shock. The Ottomans attempted military responses, sending fleets into the Indian Ocean to challenge Portuguese dominance. These campaigns were costly and ultimately inconclusive. Incidentally, the Philippine maritime networks did something different. They adapted. Trade routes shifted. New relationships formed. The Sulu Sultanate deepened its connections southward and eastward. Merchants who had operated through Malacca found new corridors. The network didn't collapse. It rerouted, the way water finds a new channel when the old one is blocked. That resilience was not accidental. It was the product of a commercial philosophy built for a world without permanent infrastructure. Build the relationship, not the road. Because roads can be seized, relationships are much harder to conquer. Something changed in that moment of Portuguese disruption, something the standard histories rarely examine carefully. The value of the Philippine maritime position actually increased when the old routes became dangerous. Merchants willing to navigate the eastern corridors through waters the Portuguese couldn't fully control became more valuable to the broader network, which meant the terms of trade shifted further in their favor. The gold that moved toward the archipelago in this period wasn't tribute. It wasn't charity. It was payment for a service that no other geography on Earth could provide at that moment, a reliable eastern passage through the heart of the spice world. What does a civilization look like when it's won without declaring victory? It looks like artifacts. It looks like burial gold that modern archaeologists uncover and struggle to fully explain. It looks like a diversity of foreign coins and weights found in pre-colonial Philippine sites, representing commercial relationships with China, Java, Brunei, the Indian coast, and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. It looks like a sophisticated enough understanding of trade law that Sulu sultans could draft commercial agreements that held across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. None of that appears in the headline version of Philippine history, and that absence is its own kind of statement. When Spanish colonizers arrived and began documenting what they found, they encountered something that confused them. Populations with no grand stone temples, no walled imperial cities, but with gold, extraordinary amounts of gold, and ships, and trade relationships stretching to places the Spanish themselves had barely mapped. They recorded the gold carefully. They recorded the ships with some alarm. They failed to record or failed to understand the system that had produced all of it. That system was the real inheritance. Every civilization eventually faces the question of what survives it. The Ottomans left architecture so massive it still shapes skylines. They left administrative systems that influenced governance for centuries after their political power faded. These are real legacies, and they deserve acknowledgement. But the maritime traders of the ancient Philippine Archipelago left something different, and perhaps something more durable. They left a proof of concept that a civilization without a single capital, without a unified army, without geographic choke points to exploit, can still move gold across the world by being indispensable. Indispensable not through monopoly, through excellence, through the kind of trust that takes generations to build and can survive any single political disaster. We often talk about identity in terms of what was taken from us. The colonial period, the erasure of scripts and systems and stories. These losses are real, and they matter deeply. All right. But there is another question worth sitting with quietly. What was already there before anything was taken? What kind of people were already moving through the world, already known and trusted and paid in gold, before anyone arrived to rename them? The answer is complicated and beautiful, and still being excavated, literally from the earth, and figuratively from the gaps between records that other empires kept. Ancient Filipino merchants didn't need a history book to validate them. The gold moved. That's the record, and it moved because they were worth paying.